Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of our book friends, and welcome to Keep It Fictional. I am your host today, Kareen, joined by my regular book friends, Sadie, Al, Virginia, and who's this? A new book friend. Today we are joined by Emma. Emma, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing this nebulous radio morning?
I'm doing great. I'm excited to be here. Talk about books.
Excellent. Well, Emma, as is tradition on Keep It Fictional, when we have a new book friend join us, we ask them for their kind of list of top 10 books. You were very game. You gave us a list with some very interesting choices, which I'm sure we will discuss today. And because I love a good analyzation, I kind of went through them and tried to like pick out some themes, some of which you have been explicitly and just like told us about them as a reader. We know that there is like a lot of really good manga on the list. I think you have some great choices there, and you have some definite allies on this panel of readers who also really love manga. You love sports, but not necessarily sports, but like sports and like the epic highs and dizzying lows and like the teamship and the camaraderie and like the friendship, the alliances and the competition. Like I feel like you really like tap into that emotion and kind of like the teamness of it all. Another theme as I was looking in your list is you've got some like really like beautifully written like heartfelt things. I feel like you're not afraid of some angst. Emma, would you say that that's right?
Yeah, that's definitely true. I don't cry very easily when I read books, but if it's something that like really feels like it might make me cry or really pushes me to that threshold, then I'm gonna eat it up.
Yeah, there's a little dash of angst in there, and there's definitely some like very beautifully written things. I was surprised to see some, not surprised, but like there was some CanCon there, so that was kind of like something very pleasant. Um, and then another theme was kind of like huzzah for the warrior bonds between men. Um, which you've also got like a love and appreciation for kind of like the Greek mythology, but I think it's kind of a little bit deeper than that. But like you love that, but it's also like the warrior bonds between men. Uh, I I hope that's accurate.
As a kid, I was a big Percy Jackson reader, and I think that like I was obsessed. Like I remember being in grade 6 and like reading through Greek god like Wikipedia pages at night before bed. Like that's just what I was super into at the time. And I think that interest kind of transitioned into my adulthood. But now you do make a great point about the warrior bonds between men because it's not just Greek mythology. I also love queer stories. So when you put those together, you get a lot of warrior bonds.
So okay, I feel like those are kind of like the ones that I've got. So at the end of the podcast, Emma, I'm going to ask you to choose like 5 words that you think describe you as a reader. So I'm going to give you the entire podcast to really think about it, and as you kind of like see that this is your life as a reader retrospective, you could maybe see if there are any inspiration points there. So yeah, we have chosen 5 books to kind of talk about and highlight. And I am going to swing it over to Virginia, who has read a book that was on your list, and is also a book that I have read. So I'm very curious to see Virginia's synopsis and also what Virginia thought about it.
Yes, so as Corinne pointed out, Emma, there's a lot of graphic novels on your list, and so that's one of the one that I chose. It has been on my radar, and I know as Corinne has read it, Fiona has read it, Liz has read it, everybody seems to have read it and loved it. So I thought it's my turn to get on that bandwagon. So this is Himawari House by Harmony Becker. I think this is a story for anyone who ever feels the call to travel to another country to spend some time there to find themselves. So after high school, Now decided to spend a gap year in Japan. She moves into a share house, that's where the title comes from, and with 4 other people, 2 Japanese persons and 2 others like her who have come to Japan, one from Singapore and one from Korea. Now was born in Japan, and her family emigrated to the States when she was a kid. And ever since she's been there, she's always felt very aware that she is not American because people never failed to point it out to her that you are not. American. Despite her best effort to assimilate, to shed everything that is Japanese about her, like refusing to speak Japanese with her mother, rejecting those beautiful bento boxes that was prepared for her because they look nothing like everybody else's lunches. Despite all of that, nobody ever considers her to be American. She's always going to be considered to be someone from some other place. And deep down, Nao does miss Japan. So she thought maybe spending a year there would be good for her. Give her a chance to figure out what she wants to do with life. And at the very least, she'll feel like she belongs again. She was too Japanese in the States, but yet in Japan, she's now too American. Even though thinks she looks like everybody else there, people treat her like a foreigner. They just know somehow that she's not really Japanese. And it doesn't help that she may have overestimated her ability to speak the language. She can kind of like have a good conversation, but like she's having a hard time keeping up when people are speaking to her. And it is just exhausting to be spending your whole day, in a world where you have to kind of like have to spend extra like mental effort to try to understand what everybody is telling you. And so every time she comes home to that share house, it's such a relief to be able to speak English again with her housemates, Heijung and Tina. Now doesn't fit in the States, and she doesn't fit in Japan. So is she ever going to find a place where she can feel like she belongs? Himawari House is a graphic novel aimed at young adults. It has won lots and lots of awards, and I can definitely see the appeal. I think we've all been there, where you're like kind of at that place where you're like not a kid anymore, you're not an adult. Like, what am I going to do with my life? I don't know. That sort of at that crossroads. And I think for anyone who has either spent or wanted to spend some time abroad to kind of discover who you are, trying to learn to be independent, explore like what life has got out for you, I think you will very much understand what Now is going through. Now, gap year is not in my vocabulary, more on that later, but what I can definitely identify with, I think, is that sort of immigrant experience. Now feels incomplete. Like she's half this and half that. And gonna take her some time to recognize that, hey, half and half kind of makes a whole. But I think as an immigrant, you never do. Like, no matter how long you've been in a place, no matter how you're surrounded by lovely people, like all my book friends here that are so supportive, you just know that you're different. And that, like, no matter what, like, you just, everything makes you feel like you don't quite belong. And I really like how the author sort of puts in a lot of the dialogue in multiple languages. In Japan, a lot of the speech bubbles have Japanese and English in it. And then when Heijung talk, you got Korean and English, and it really gives you a sense of like sort of how hard it is for the characters to sort of do that switching between the thinking, between the languages. And as the author's note points out at the end, there is no shame in that sort of mixed language, like accents is not a shame. You should, like you feel like yes, like everybody's unique. And it's just this combination of everybody from sort of around the world, like communicating and speaking a language. And there's no such thing as like, it has to be a certain way. And I really love sort of those subtle observations that the author mentions that ring so true. Like some of the characters was talking about how, there's things that you can never say in your own language that it's just easier to say in English. And that is like so, so, so true. There's like words that I will never say in Chinese in polite company. But yet somehow when it's in English, it's like it doesn't mean as much somehow. And I think it's those little things that like brings really that authenticity to the story. And you can see that this is someone who has really lived that experience. And of course, like I feel like the character that I most identify with is definitely Heijung from Korea. As I said, gap year is not a thing. I have no idea what that means at all because you're brought up to believe and to know that like your job is to study, 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 and study. Get good grades, go to university, study some more. That is what you are supposed to do. So I think for her to kind of like feel it is such a much bigger deal for her to like say, hey, I'm going to take off for a year, while now it's kind of like, going traveling for a year is not a big thing for her, but for Hae-young, it is such for Hae-jung is such a like, it takes a lot to defy your parents and just be like, no, I am going to just go do that. And I can see this is something like absolutely that they will disown you for doing this. And I think that conflict that she has is definitely something that it rings so true to me. And that I think there's a lot of things in this book that will appeal to many different characters, whether you are someone who, like, was looking for kind of that friendship story, the found family story, or like, there's a little bit of romance in there with some misunderstood characters. You will cry. I don't know if Emma cried in this one. I definitely did, and I know Corinne said that she did too. And the art is great. Like, it's very fluid, very smooth. It also got some like classic like manga facial expressions in them, like, and so it's just it's a nice, heartwarming kind of story, with a lot of depth to it, especially I think for anyone who just needed to sort of see themselves in these stories where they are kind of looking at like, like, who am I, like, like and when you feel like, you're trying to find your own place in the world. So this is Himawari House by Harmony Becker, and I would love to hear from Emma why this book is on your list.
Yeah, so I actually only read this book last year. I think it's a pretty new book. And immediately I like fell in love with it. As Corinne mentioned earlier, I've always kind of been a big manga reader. I love a shoujo manga. So a manga that's kind of like high school, slice of life, maybe a bit of romance in there, kind of about interpersonal relationships. And that was initially why this book appealed to me, is it has that kind of like shoujo romantic, like focus on like these girl friendships and these relationships between girls that I really really connected with. But like Virginia was saying, it's so much more beyond that. Like, first off, it's got this kind of like shoujo-esque story, but it's not a Japanese story. It's an American story, but there's also Korean characters, there's characters from Singapore. You get all of these different cultural experiences, these different experiences of like womanhood that these young women are going through. And so many of the shoujo manga that I've read are like about high school girls. They start when the girls are 15. It's about the boys that they like and the like romance relationships. And this is like, the romance is such a subplot that's not even really addressed until the very end of the story anyway. And I loved that. It focused so much more on like adult friendships between women and adult problems that women experience. And that's not a topic that's ever really talked about in a lot of shoujo manga. So it was like a shoujo manga for older readers, a shoujo manga for that adults could enjoy as well. And like Virginia had said, like, the art is so gorgeous. I did not cry when I read it, but there were definitely moments. I know Corinne's giving me a look. I don't cry that easily. I did not cry when I read it, but there are definitely those moments that like tug at your heartstrings that really got to me. So yeah, I don't know. I thought it was such a beautiful book.
Yeah, no, this was like a wailing cry for me because it just spoke to that like sadness and like loss and like finding yourself in between places. It's funny, like Instagram's algorithm spat out the Adam Sandler skit where he's pretending to be a travel agent. And he's like, just so you know, like, I can take you to the Amalfi Coast and show you these mountains. But if you're a sad person at home, you're going to be a sad person in another country. This trip is not going to fundamentally change who you are. And I feel like a lot of travel literature tries to say that of you're just going to eat, pray, love your way through your trip. And this book is like, nope. You're all the problems that you had at home, you're still very much going to have them there, just with different food. Yeah, so thank you, Virginia, and thank you, Emma, for your insights as to why that's on your list. We're going to swing over to a fiction book. We're going to swing over to Sadie, who's going to celebrate the warrior bonds between men.
Am I ever? All right. The Trojan War. The Battle for Helen. The face that launched 1,000 ships. The wily Greeks who snuck behind Troy's gates in a giant wooden horse and finally ended the more than a decade-long. Now, most people are at least a little familiar with this Greek story, made most famous by Homer's The Iliad. I imagine less, although still some, can probably boast that they have even read the Iliad cover to cover, or at least parts of it, or at least have seen the movie with Brad Pitt and Orlando Bloom. Anyone? No. Okay. Regardless of how you, okay, all right. Some late admissions there. Regardless of how you have interacted with it, this story is a familiar one. We know its heroes. We have Hector, Paris, Achilles, Odysseus, Agamemnon. We more or less know what started the war, Paris stealing Helen away from Agamemnon's brother Menelaus. And we more or less know how the war ends, the famous horse. But what happened during the war? Or what happened leading up to the war? Or even what happened to make our heroes the heroes with a capital H that they are? So the book that I picked from Emma's list is The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. This is actually the second Madeline Miller book that I have read. The first, Circe, I actually read because of a recommendation from former book friend Fiona. And I want to preface this by saying that, similar to you, Emma, I have always loved Greek mythology. I was a little bit too old for the Percy Jackson books, so I did not have that when I was a kid. But I did study Greek mythology in university, in my undergrad, kind of both from a historical and a poetic standpoint, as well as from a theatrical view. So I've read a lot of Greek plays, lots and lots of Greek plays. So I came into this book probably with maybe a little bit more pre-existing knowledge of kind of the story and the characters than some people might. However, one thing that Madeline Miller loves to do in her books, and one thing that I love that she does in her books, is that she tells these stories from new perspectives and new lenses. And she always puts a new kind of take on the classic stories that people are familiar with. So with Circe, she had the story told from the point of view of Circe, finally giving the witch her own voice. And in the Song of Achilles, our story is told from the perspective of Achilles' inseparable companion, as one source calls him, Patroclus. Now, Patroclus is only 5 years old when he sees Achilles for the first time. His father is hosting a set of games in his kingdom, and Achilles, accompanied by his father, King Peleus of Phthia, is competing. Patroclus is in awe of the young boy with the golden hair who runs with the speed and grace of a god. That, his father says to him after the race is over, is what a son should be. Patroclus knows this. He knows that he is really only a prince in name and not in ability or in reputation. His father has made this perfectly clear to him since he was born. Now, it is not until Patroclus is 10 years old that he sees Achilles again. One day while he is out alone in the fields around his father's palace, an older boy demands a pair of dice that Patroclus is playing with. Not wanting his father to call him a coward again, Patroclus pushes the boy, causing him to fall and smash his head on a rock and die. The nobleman, who is the boy's father, demands retribution. And so his father permanently exiles Patroclus from the kingdom. He's no longer a prince. He no longer has any family. And he is brought to Phthia, a kingdom known for taking in strays and foster boys, a smaller kingdom than the one he was born in, but a kingdom well known among the Greeks. The king is said to have married a god, making his son a demigod. That son is Achilles. Now, when Patroclus first arrives, he tries to keep to himself. He doesn't want people to know that he killed someone. He doesn't want them to kind of think about him in that way, and he doesn't know what they're going to think of him. So he just kind of keeps to himself, keeps a low profile. However, it isn't long before Achilles starts to take an interest in him, seeking him out when Patroclus is hiding from the men who teach the boys to fight. Achilles is curious about why Patroclus left his kingdom. Eventually, he tells him, and Achilles says, well, why did you not just lie? Why didn't you tell them that you were defending yourself and that you didn't do it? Patroclus isn't sure, but he asks Achilles, or says to Achilles, you wouldn't have lied. And he says, no, you're right. From then on, Achilles takes Patroclus as his companion and his friend. He moves him from the boys' dorms into his own room, and the boys become inseparable. Patroclus begins to learn more about Achilles. His mother, as rumored, is a goddess, and Patroclus learns the truth of this rumor and even has the opportunity to meet her. Thetis, a dryad or a sea nymph, who immediately hates Patroclus and who is determined to turn her son into a god. However, more than that, Patroclus learns that Achilles is a kind and sweet boy who plays the lyre beautifully and would rather joke around with Patroclus than listen to his father's stories of long dead warriors and heroes. He is beautiful, he is handsome, he is graceful, and he is the most amazing fighter that Patroclus has ever seen. Patroclus starts to notice that his feelings towards Achilles are changing. And so when Thetis sends Achilles away to study under the centaur Chiron, Patroclus sees no other option but to follow. Under Chiron's tutelage, the two boys learn about food and cooking, about medicine, about how to live off the land. They live in a rose quartz cave in the middle of the mountains, and apart from Thetis's visits, the three of them are left alone to study and to learn. And Achilles and Patroclus begin to grow into young men. It is a wonderful few years that Patroclus will often find himself reminiscing on in less pleasant times. The years are made even more wonderful when Achilles, despite his mother's protestations, admits that he too loves Patroclus, and he hopes that they will never, ever be parted from each other. The beautiful peace of the mountains is broken, unfortunately, with news from Achilles' father. Menelaus, the king of Sparta, has called the kingdoms of Greece to his aid. His wife, Helen, has been stolen away by Paris, prince of Troy, and Achilles is being called home to fight. A fight which none know then will last over a decade. A fight which is prophesied to bring Achilles the godlike fame that his mother has always wanted for him. And a fight that is also prophesied to cause his death. So the book continues on through the Battle of Troy, focusing not just on the fighting of the battle, but on life in the camps, on the relationships between the men of the camps and the armies, and the relationship between Achilles and Patroclus. More specifically, the relationship as Achilles starts to gain more fame and starts to gain more pride. I really, really enjoyed this book. As I mentioned, I love Greek mythology, so any take on the classics I always really enjoy, especially one that provides a new perspective and a new lens with which to view this story. Emma, I think you said that you really love the queer stories as well, and that kind of creates those warrior bonds. So you definitely, I can see why this book appealed to you with that. It is honestly, it's a beautiful story told about these two men. I didn't actually know a ton about the Achilles myth before I read this book, and I waited until after I finished it to look into the myth more and kind of see what Madeline Miller was adding and what was true to the myth. And quite a lot of the actual storyline is very true to the myth. So all of the information about Patroclus being Achilles' companion, while Homer never actually alludes to them being lovers, another poet kind of writing at the same time does. So that kind of relationship had always been within the myth. And Madeline Miller just chose to focus on it and chose to bring that to the forefront and brought that kind of that connection that these two men have over their life into the main part of the story. Yeah, it was just such a beautiful story between them. And I think that if you do really like Greek mythology or classic mythology, if you are really into the Trojan War, if that is an area of Greek mythology that you're really, really into, then you want something that has a bit more substance maybe than just battles and fighting and those kinds of things. Then yeah, I would definitely recommend this. And yeah, I'm super curious, Emma. I can see why you have it on your list, but I'm curious why you think that it is one of your top books.
Yeah, like obviously, like I said before, like I always love the Greek gods. So that's kind of initially what drew me to the book. But it was the queer story. It was like the relationship between the two boys. And I love that. I'm glad that you had mentioned that like Madeline Miller did not add that. That wasn't something that she had completely come up with. Like that's something that's rooted in Achilles' actual mythology. And I didn't know that other poets had written about them being lovers before, but I have seen instances where like on urns and in like ancient Greek artwork, a lot of the time they're portrayed as like being a little bit closer than just friends. And so it's really cool. Corinne's laughing at me. It's really cool to see how that story that's always kind of been like vaguely alluded to in mythology is like given a forefront. Like Patroclus is given a voice, he's given agency in this version of it. This is a book that did make me cry. I did get a little teary-eyed at the end. I mean, like people, I would assume that people know how the Trojan War ended, so I don't think there's any spoilers going on here. But like when people start dying, it made me sad. Um, and something I think really special about this book, for my experience reading it, is I read it summer 2022 while I was on a trip in the south of France to visit my sister who lived there at the time. And so I was like sitting on the beach at the Mediterranean with my Song of Achilles, like reading about how Patroclus and Achilles were going swimming in the sea at night and then like looking out and being right in front of that exact same sea. Like it was a really powerful moment for me. So I think I would have absolutely fallen in love with the book regardless of where and when I had read it. But that being the context of it, like I was really in that place, not in Greece, but in France. But I was really in that place where their story took place. And I think that really hit home for me. So yeah, if you like the warrior bonds between men, if you like queer stories, if you like Greek mythology, I think there's a lot of different appeals to this one. And I haven't actually read Circe yet, but it's on my list, and I'm excited to get to that one because I loved Madeline Miller's take of the traditional Greek story. So I'd love to hear kind of a more feminine perspective, what it's like when she's writing from a woman's perspective as well.
Nice. I just love to think about like urns being like the original fan fiction. Like, let me just carve this out of what I really think happened.
Like, oh well, I heard that they were gay, so we're gonna make them gay here.
We just carve this out. I think, and like Al will probably agree with me, one of the funniest things about the movie Troy, other than like its entire existence, which is just it's a brutal movie. Not in the content, just to watch it is a soul-wrenching experience, is that they had cast Brad Pitt as Achilles, and so they had to make sure it was like not gay, not gay, absolutely like Patrick, like this is his cousin, this is his cousin, they're really close cousins, like cousins, family bond. Not that. Okay. Yeah, so that I think, and probably Al, you can agree, like they kept hammering that home so often that it almost became like a drinking game of like, no, like he really likes the woman, and this is like his cool cousin. It's okay to be friends with your cousins. Yeah. Yeah, so that's quite so this one feels a little more enjoyable perhaps as an experience. Although everyone's hair in Troy is truly something to behold.
How did they
Truly,
fight with
truly.
that? That's what I'm curious. Like, how did they actually fight with like the beautiful flowing locks?
I'm going to assume like ponytails. Like they had ancient scrunchies that just haven't survived like the rigors of time. Archaeologists chime in. I don't know. I don't know. Okay, so we're gonna switch from warriors to other warriors. I am kind of like a different like look at mythology. We are talking about another one of Emma's picks. I think this is a bit of like a retro throwback pick. It was a little retro for me because I remember reading the first volume a while ago. This is one of the big three of kind of like your shonen manga. So on this list, you've got like One Piece, which is never going to end. Naruto, which surprisingly did end and then started like a secondary story. So that's also never going to end. And last but not least on this list, and one of Emma's picks, is Bleach, or because it's in all capitals, Bleach, which I think it deserves an exclamation point. So Bleach, which you have probably seen, I'm sure you're familiar with if you wanted to or not, ran from 2001 to 2016. So just drink that in. That is 16-ish years. Years. That's like over a decade. And it only ended because the author and illustrator, and I'm absolutely going to butcher this, Tite Kubo.
Yeah, you got it right. Tite
Oh,
Kubo.
Okay. Essentially said that he had reached his limit. He was done. He later he had kind of health problems. Obviously, this was a very, very punishing schedule to kind of churn out this much material. But I really just like that even he was tired. He was very tired. But again, it has over 120 million volumes in circulation. I believe it had 74 volumes. It inspired an anime, a reboot anime, 4 animated movies, various video games, and my favorite little factoid, 10 rock musicals, which I would absolutely pay cash money to see. That sounds rad. The merch is everywhere. Again, it's kind of touted as one of these like the big classics, and you can kind of see why. So for this, I read it comes in these lovely 3-in-1 volumes now. I read through the first one. I realized that I had actually read this when it first came out, and then I remember like, oh, this is really fun. Like, how many volumes are there? Oh, never mind. Because at that point it wasn't finished. And I was like, I am not investing so many hours of my life in case I don't get an ending. It is kind of like a very simple story that gets complicated really fast. It is about a average high school student with shockingly orange hair. Ishigo Kurosaki?
Ichigo Kurosaki.
Ichigo? Okay.
Ichigo.
Okay. He is your average, typical high school student, except for like the weird side thing is that he can see ghosts. But like, it's not annoying to him. You know, he's got some cool ghosts that can kind of help him scare away bullies. He can kind of chat with them when he's feeling lonely. He doesn't think of this as kind of anything strange or unusual. It's just kind of like a quirk in that some people can't tell time. He can see ghosts. We've all got our stuff. And this kind of special ability allows him to see Rukia Kuchiki. You can tell I haven't seen the anime. I'm so sorry.
It's Rukia Kuchiki.
Okay, awesome. Who enters his town in search of a hollow. Hollows are kind of like these giant monstrous creatures with like a little gap in their chest. They are lost souls who hunt and devour ghosts and humans alike. And Rukia is a Shinigami, or a soul reaper. She is a soldier who kind of helps usher these souls from the world of the living to the soul society, which is an afterworld or an afterlife world, you know, where you're done. The done place. Because they obviously can't be hanging around in Earth eating their sisters. That is frowned upon. And so Rukia is kind of hunting this one hollow, and despite not supposed to being able to see her, Ichigo does. And so he kind of follows along because she's got a weird vibe and an amazing aesthetic and a big sword. So obviously, why not? He follows her to where she does battle with one of these hollows. But she's severely wounded trying to protect him from this creature. And so, in a moment of desperation, she transfers her Soul Reaper powers to him so that he can finish the battle, defeat the Hollow, and everything can go back to normal. Except, oh no. Once you give your powers away, she can't get them back. And so she is stuck in the body of an ordinary human while Ichigo has all of these rad Soul Reaper powers that he cannot control, but someone has to fight the Hollows. So what does she do? She decides to go undercover as a high school student and train him in the ways of a Soul Reaper in enough time, hopefully, that she can figure out how to get her powers back and everything can remain back to normal and he can like pass his high school exams. Yeah. Ichigo has some friends that kind of partner with him to take on these evil spirits, including one named Chad, which made me laugh for about 5 minutes straight, just because it's Chad and it's very funny. Orihime, who's like a cute girl with red hair, and my favorite character due to his vibe, Uryu Ishida. Love that. He's great. And so together they fight evil. He is a part-time student, full-time Soul Reaper, which is not enough hours in the day, and he needs to seek out a better work-life balance. The story starts kind of like very cutesy. Oh, he's just kind of like fighting crime or like fighting evil, and like, oh, isn't it funny that she's actually this kind of like mythological being that has to go to high school? And then it gets real dark real fast. Yeah, so there's a lot more like politics and life and death societies and betrayals and politics and like machinations that are going on behind the scenes. And so it kind of expands out for like this very simple story into something like a much bigger world, much bigger, almost one could argue 74 volumes worth of a world, into this kind of mythology that the author is creating. I think that's right. I read so many Wikipedia articles, so many, Emma, because I was like, okay, I know what happens here, but I know this is not all that happens. And then there's like Quincy's, another word that made me laugh for a million years. Aran cars. There's a lot of bad guys that happen, each of them with like some very cool aesthetics. Yeah. So Emma, like, what is it about Bleach that appeals for you? I can understand why. Again, it's hugely popular. But what about this story speaks to you?
Yeah, I actually, full disclosure, started with the anime and only got into the manga after I'd watched the anime, because I started the anime when I was in like grade 8 or 9. And I got into the manga afterwards because I was like, oh, this is so, so, so cool. I need more of this in my life. And I'm glad that you brought up the aesthetics, because that's actually one of the things that I think kind of sets Bleach apart from a lot of other shonen series. Because, like, you look at the shonen series nowadays, a lot of them are really similar. They're violent. Usually there's like ghosts, curses, demons, all these kind of various like similar types of bad guys that are involved. I think like Jujutsu Kaisen, one that's really popular right now, is super, super similar to Bleach and how it kind of like where it draws its mythos from, and where it draws like its power system from. But one of the things that I think Bleach does that really sets it apart from the others is the aesthetic choices. And Tite Kubo, the author and illustrator of it, is really, really big into like fashion and street style. So you look at all these different characters, these different like types and races of characters, like Uryu, the Quincy. So he fights with like this bow and arrow sort of thing. Like his fashion aesthetic is a bit more like, when he's wearing his like fighting uniform, his fashion aesthetic is a bit more like European, Germanic. The Quincy's, these this race of people in Bleach, they get all of their names and words and the names of their powers and stuff from the German language. The Arancars, their aesthetic is much more like Spanish and Latinx in design, because they get all their words, like the word Arancar is a Spanish word, and all their powers come from Spanish words. So like you get all these different fashion aesthetics, and all the characters, even when they're wearing like their regular street clothes, they all have like very fun fashion styles. You get all these different fashion aesthetics, all these different kind of like cultural aesthetics, cultural references that you get throughout the story, in addition to this like very kind of large and complicated world where there's all these different politics that are going on, all of these different like philosophies as far as like life and death and who deserves to live and who deserves to die and what's the balance between the world of the living and the soul society where the souls go when they go to the afterlife. Like Soul Reaper's whole purpose is maintaining that balance, and then there's some people who want to askew it, and that creates all these different like political conflicts that go on in the story. It's just so much, but I love it because I think it's just like, I think it's very unique. But at the same time, like what Tite Kubo did with Bleach inspired what a lot of different shonen mangakas right now are doing. Where like I watched Jujutsu Kaisen for the first time and I go, oh, this is just a remake of Bleach. I read like the first couple of pages. Do you agree? No? Okay, we'll talk about that. I think they're really similar. Or like I read the first couple of pages or first couple chapters of this more recent young adult novel called Cemetery Boys, which is Mexican in its mythology, but the way that like superpowers work in this world, it's literally Bleach. Like they have lost souls that become corrupted, and then the people have to use their knives instead of swords, but they have to use them to send them to the afterlife. It's all very similar. So yeah, I think Bleach inspired a lot of modern stories in the way that it's designed and the way that its magic system is designed. But one of the reasons that I love it, one of the reasons it's so close to home for me, is it is very nostalgic because I watched it when I was younger. And nowadays, in this current kind of anime manga climate, Bleach has gotten a reboot. So to give you a quick little rough overview of what happened there, the manga finished. The anime was finished before the manga was done. And I think the author got on kind of an inconsistent schedule with publishing the manga because of the health problems that Corinne had mentioned. And so the anime was canceled before the manga ever ended. And all of these volumes of the manga came out that were never adapted into an anime. And then 10, 12 years later, they finally said, okay, Bleach is over now. And people still love Bleach. So we're finally going to bring the anime back. So I had read a bunch of the manga. I'd watched the entirety of the first show, and I was fully content with just being like, I'm gonna die and never see how this ends. Like it's just never gonna, I'm never gonna see how Bleach ends. I'm never gonna see the ending animated, and that's fine. I've come to terms with it. And like 10 years later, 10 years of my life have passed, and they brought Bleach back. So it's currently airing. It's currently kind of in the middle of its last run. And for me, it's so exciting because it's made it popular again. They've really upped the animation. The quality is a lot better. Old Bleach has a lot of problems with it. The quality of the new series is just like absolutely mind-blowing and phenomenal. So that's why it's kind of like a relevant story for me right now, is it's living in this like new age of popularity. I should have worn my Bleach t-shirt today to show off. But yeah, it's I think it's just a phenomenal story. It's like it's an action fighting shonen. So if that's not for you, that's not for you. There's plenty of other action fighting shonens out there that people can get into, but Bleach is my personal favorite.
I have to ask because I saw some angry anime nerd, and that's not a slight because I am like, yeah, it's me too. Argue that like to properly like wrap up the story, like they were disappointed in kind of the ending of the manga. To properly wrap up the story, it would have taken another 2 years of like writing. Were you satisfied with the ending of it?
Yeah, so that was a huge thing where like Tite Kubo had all these health problems at the end of the manga. And so the last couple volumes, the last couple chapters are really rushed, and a lot of the art in them is like a little bit more bare bones than if you were to compare it to like volume 1 of Bleach. But one of the really nice things about them bringing the anime back in the 2020s is with how much animation has improved. Like I was disappointed with how the manga ended. I felt like it was rushed. I felt like it was kind of lazy. Not the story, but more the art, and the illustrations themselves. But with them rebooting the anime, Tite Kubo is really, really involved in the anime reboot. So he's saying like, oh, this is how I wanted to end it. If I had more time, this is how I would have ended it. And that's the route that they're taking with the anime reboot. So they're adding new scenes. They're like giving characters more fleshed out storylines. A lot of characters where people were like, I wanted to see more of him. They're giving those additional scenes in the anime reboot. So for the fans that were disappointed the first time around, we're kind of getting a little treat with this new anime series. It's very fun.
10 years later. All right, so good things come to those who wait. And so if you've been waiting for our last book, we're going to swing it over to Al.
All right. So just before I get into the book, I want to quickly say that if you like artists who pull inspiration from a bunch of different cultures, from a bunch of street fashion, you should check out JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. So just gonna leave that there. No more commentary. But with this, we're getting back to Greek mythology. And like Sadie, like you, Emma, I'm a huge fan of Greek and Roman mythology. I was also a bit too old for the Percy Jackson books. They hit more at my brother's age. But I've always been a huge fan of Greek and Roman mythology. So the book I chose to read for today is one I've actually been meaning to read almost since it came out. The Odyssey is one of my favorite classic works. So, of course, when one of Canada's bright lights of literature, Margaret Atwood, wrote a novel about the Odyssey from the perspective of one of the women of the story, I got excited. So, today I'm talking about The Penelopiad by Margaret Atwood, which is a retelling of the story of Penelope, the wife of Odysseus. It's narrated by the dead Penelope, as well as by the 12 maids who were hanged after sleeping with the noble suitors of Penelope that she warded off from marrying her for years by weaving a death shroud all day and picking apart that same shroud every night. So in this novel, we begin with Penelope's childhood, born to King Icarius of Sparta and a naiad, or water nymph. She grew up feeling estranged from both of her parents, her mother because she was distant, both emotionally and physically, and her father because when Penelope was young, he had her thrown into the sea, presumably as some sort of sacrifice. While she survived this due to a flock of ducks saving her and towing her back to shore, and her father became more doting after this, Penelope was never able to banish the thought that at any point he might try to kill her again. At the same time, we learn about Penelope's relationship to her more famous cousin, Helen. Helen is immensely beautiful and knows it, and leverages her beauty for her own ends. Penelope feels plain and reserved next to Helen, who often takes the time to prod at Penelope's and others' insecurities. We move on quickly to Penelope's marriage to Odysseus. At age 15, she was only 15. I want to make a note. Her family has a contest for Penelope's hand. Odysseus was one of the competitors for Helen's hand as well, and Penelope thinks somewhat self-deprecatingly that she's a runner-up prize, something to be settled for, rather than a prize in her own right. Odysseus wins the competition, of course, and the two are swiftly wed. On their wedding night, Odysseus quickly charms the young Penelope, though the older Penelope narrating is quick to note that he is a charmer by nature, and perhaps she has different ideas about him now. Odysseus quickly convinces Icarius to let him take Penelope with him back to Ithaca, rather than observing the tradition where the husband becomes a part of the wife's family, consolidating the wealth in the wife's household. Icarius is not pleased about it, but he relents, and Penelope journeys across the sea with her new husband to her new home. She brings along an elderly maid, who quickly dies, leaving Penelope alone in a strange new place, though quickly joined by a young son, Telemachus. From here, the story goes as we know from the Odyssey. News comes that Helen has run off with Paris, a prince of Troy, and her husband Menelaus and his brother Agamemnon are going to call in the favors they're owed and wage war against Troy to get her back. Odysseus tries to pretend to be insane to get out of going to war, but is found out and goes anyway. Penelope is left behind, and the first 10 years go by without much incident as she learns to manage the household and becomes a good wife. She does this to impress Odysseus, she hopes, when he returns, that he will praise her, say she is worth 100 Helens. But as more time passes, people begin to believe that Odysseus is dead, and suitors begin to come to the household to try and vie for her hand. We learn that Penelope enlisted the 12 youngest maids to help her spy on the suitors and unravel her weaving at night, which works for years until the secret gets out. Happily, or perhaps unhappily, Odysseus returns before this becomes too much of a problem, and in revealing himself kills the suitors and orders the execution of the maids, as they are thought to have been collaborators. Penelope doesn't know any of this until later, though, as she was asleep in the women's quarters when it all went down. She grieves, but cannot show it too openly, unless Odysseus thinks her a traitor too. I've got to say, this is the first book I've read for this podcast that infiltrated my dreams. After the first night that I read part of this book, I ended up dreaming about the 12 hanged maids. I found them in a barn, and they surrounded me, crowding in closer and closer until I was subsumed. And I think that's a pretty accurate metaphor for this book. I didn't mention this in my summary, but throughout this book, there are interludes where the maids form a sort of chorus, and they tell their part of the story. They're a big part of the novel, and they quite literally haunt the narrative. The interludes with the maids are probably one of my favorite parts of the book. They critique Penelope's perspective as well as the perspective of the Odyssey as a whole, giving voice to the otherwise voiceless lower class of slaves in ancient Greek society. The maids and their poetic chorus are my favorite part of this book, a feminist and classist critique of everything going on about them, bitter and regretful and sometimes bitingly funny. Penelope's story was interesting, and I liked the insight into her character that Atwood weaves, but the maids were what kept me reading. They critique the way the story is told in the Odyssey, but they also throw into question the story Penelope is telling. So there's a lot about double standards, there's a lot about different perspectives and how they affect what we understand. They also, of course, get the last word, which I loved. This was a great book. It moves along at a fast clip and gives you just enough to keep you hungry to keep reading. I do wish there had been a little bit more depth to Penelope's story. This is a fairly short novel, and you don't get to delve too deeply. You just kind of get the surface level. But at the same time, I think it works. Penelope is not the kind of character who would tell everything. If you're a fan of the classics but want to see a different spin on them, if you want to see sort of a more feminist retelling, if you liked Circe perhaps, then the Penelopiad might be for you. And Emma, I am really interested to hear why this is on your list.
Yeah, so I read it kind of in a bit of a reading slump, and so the fact that the book was a bit shorter, the fact that it's a bit more of a novella was perfect for me at the time, and I think that's probably a big factor as to why I read it so quickly. It like really consumed me. And I, as someone who always was interested in Greek mythology and studied a bit of gender studies in my undergrad, I always love like a like kind of critique on the class, critique on or not a critique on the feminism, but a feminist critique on a classic text. That was something that really connected with me. And Sadie mentioned earlier, you read a lot of Greek plays. I always really liked reading Greek plays. I really liked reading the tragedies. And so the interludes with the chorus line were also my favorite aspect of it. But it's not a chorus line in that like it's like a traditional chorus line from a Greek tragedy, because each chorus line is done a little bit differently. Some of them are like sung as sea shanties. One of them near the end is like a courtroom scene, if I remember correctly. Like the choruses, the bits that the chorus does, that are narrated by the hanged maids, these are kind of like anachronistic interjections into the story, which I think was really fascinating because you're getting a perspective from like a contemporary standpoint, looking back on the events that are happening here. So you've got Penelope's stories, Penelope's chapters, where you're getting more of a narrative. But I, like Al had mentioned, was more interested in what the maids had to say about that, what the maids had to say about what was going on in Greece at the time, but also coming from a contemporary perspective. Because they're not speaking to their experience in the moment, they're speaking to their experience looking back on it from the afterlife. And so I forget exactly what other genres they incorporate in those chorus lines. The two that really stick out in my memory are the one that's sung like a sea shanty and the one that's like a courtroom drama. But they each one, like Atwood uses a different genre, and so it's really cool to see how she's kind of throwing in these different elements into the story. It's not just Penelope's story. It's not just Penelope and then a little chorus interjection here and there. So it's very fascinating. This is also the only Margaret Atwood book I've read. So I don't know how I would connect with any of her other stuff, but I really, really loved this one. And it makes me interested to read more of her stuff, but I don't know if she's written anything else that was about Greek mythology. And that's kind of the big reason why I connected with it so much. But Sadie, I think you would really appreciate this one if you haven't read it yet. It sounds like something you'd enjoy.
I agree. I was just thinking that because I I feel a little bit ashamed as a Canadian to say that I also have never read a Margaret Atwood book. I know. So maybe this will be the one that I start with.
Yeah, I loved it, and I'm really glad that you read it out. I'm sorry that it gave you a nightmare.
I wouldn't even call it a nightmare. It was just really weird.
Yeah.
I feel like at your admission, Sadie, Fiona just felt a chill up their spine and doesn't know why.
I know. I'll have to check in with them and make sure that they're okay.
All right. So, Emma, we have talked about 4 of your favorite books. And my challenge for you at the beginning of the podcast was what are 5 words that describe you as a reader?
Yeah, I wish I'd brought a pen and paper with me because I have nothing written down to go off of right now. 5 words that describe me as a reader. That is a tricky one. Oh, I feel like I'm in the hot seat now. And all of a sudden I've forgotten the entire English language. 5 words that describe me as a reader. I think engaging is a good one. I don't typically like a story that doesn't really have a lot of plot. I like a story where there's a bit going on, a bit that you can kind of sink your teeth into. I don't want to use the word angsty, but I think it's pretty accurate to describe the type of stuff that I'm usually drawn to. Like, I love an emotional journey. I love something that's about like interpersonal relationships between people. As Corinne had said, the highs and lows of sports, and which is interesting because you mentioned that at the beginning, but none of my picks that were about sports were spoken about here. So the listeners of the podcast won't really get what we're talking about. But I do love a good sports drama and like a good like I do love reading about like the emotional friendships that come through sports drama. What else? I love queer stories. If it's queer, I will most likely read it. That's not to say I'll definitely enjoy it, but if it's queer, I'll probably give it a shot. Especially if it's queer and incorporates like mythologies and fantasy elements to it. That's always something that I really love. I think those were 3 words. I need 2 more. What else? Can I use mythological? That's a good word. Yeah, because it doesn't necessarily have to be Greek mythology, but Bleach touches on mythology and philosophy, things like that. Things that that are like there's action to the story, there's plot to the story, but there's more going on behind the scenes. Like the story itself is a commentary on something philosophical, on some sort of mythology. That's usually something that connects with me really well. Like all these different, when we talked about Bleach, all these different cultures have different like life and death mythologies that you can get in different stories, and those are the kinds of stories I usually really like to read. And the last word, illustrated. I love an illustrated story. I love a comic. I love a graphic novel. I love a manga. It's not the only thing I read, but it's a lot of what I read. And so I love something that's illustrative, that has illustrative elements to it, whether or not it's a comic book or whether or not that's something that's kind of incorporated in there. Yeah, and I think that's 5 words.
Excellent. Yep, that's exactly 5. So engaging, angsty, queer, mythological, and illustrated is how Emma sees themselves as a reader. And then just to end the podcast, I have one very important, very divisive question for you, Emma. Do you purchase a lot of books?
I do purchase a lot of books. I like to I get more from the library than I purchase, but I own quite a collection. I have quite a big manga collection. This is a little shout out to Virginia. I own all 45 volumes of Haikyuu and the art book. So with manga, and especially a series that I like really, really love, like Haikyuu, that's something that I'll purchase. But most of the books that I read are from the library, although I do have a collection at home that I have to admit to.
Now, Emma, when you are purchasing books in a series, do you purchase all the books in the series? Or do you purchase the 2nd and 4th and 7th in a series like a psychopath?
This sounds like a targeted question at somebody I don't know who you're targeting, but so okay. It's a complex, my answer is complex. My answer is not straightforward because when I'm purchasing books from a series, I want to end with the entire series. That doesn't necessarily mean I can purchase them in order. So to give you an example, when I bought Haikyuu, I started I think I actually started with the later ones because I started with the ones that I hadn't read yet, that hadn't been adapted yet, that I wanted to read first. So I think the first volume I bought was probably like 34 and then 35 and then 36. And then continued purchasing through 45 so I could read the end of the story. But once I bought those, I was like, okay, I've read these now and I want to own the entire set, but not every store is always going to have the entire set on hand. So when I'd go to the bookstore and I'd say, oh, they have volumes 1, 5, 6, 7, 8, I'm going to buy those ones. And then I fill in the gaps. So now, years later, I have all 45 volumes of Haikyuu, but it wasn't a straightforward process. And that doesn't pain me. I'm totally content with doing it like that.
Well, eventually Emma gets the whole series, so that's okay, Corinne, right?
Yeah,
That is
eventually I
okay.
get it.
Yeah, so kind
And
of
I-
like both sides, because
Yeah.
yeah,
I don't want to have an incomplete series, but if it has to be incomplete while I'm purchasing it because one store doesn't have all 45 volumes at one time, such is life. Corinne's not happy
it
with
still
my
fits
answer.
though, Corinne. Come on, like, because they're still collecting the whole thing, unlike some other people, like some of us here that may not have the whole thing.
And
Okay,
never
we're gonna
will.
wrap up.
Emma, can I ask a question? Do you listen
up?
to music when you're reading?
Not usually. If I'm like on the bus, if I'm like reading on the bus, I can like have something kind of mellow going on, but not usually, no. Not like at home. If I'm at home reading, it's quiet.
And do you listen to
Excellent.
podcasts when you're reading?
Ooh, that's way too much. No, if I'm listening to a podcast, I can't even be like doing something. I can like maybe be doing the dishes, but not something that requires any brain power.
Come on now, do another one.
No, I'm just enjoying that Corinne has apparently died.
I like these questions.
Do you reread? Are you
I
a
do reread.
rereader?
Yeah. When I read the Song of Achilles, I was on vacation. And so I finished the book and I was like, no, that can't be it. And I brought like 5 books along with me on my vacation. And at that point I had read all 5. And so once I finished the Song of Achilles, I was like, well, got to start over then. And I reread like half of it before I came home. But yeah, there's definitely like I've read Aristotle and Dante twice. I've read that's just one. I've read Slaughterhouse-Five a few different times. Like I definitely reread. And I re-listen to audiobooks. If it's an audio like Beartown, I've listened to that audiobook I think like 4 times now. Yeah. What?
All right. So we are very happy to have you. There are some things you have in common with some of our readers. There is some kind of like shared love of like manga or mythology. There is some love of sport, just in general. Yeah, and yeah, your Venn diagram has many things in common with many people, and then you're your own reader, and it's fine for everyone to be different, even if they're wrong. So thank you so much for joining us, Emma. We look forward to all of your book recommendations in the coming weeks. Thank you so much for asking our existential questions and for sharing your favorite books with us and why they kind of spoke and resonated with you. So we hope the rest of our book friends listening also look forward to all of Emma's picks, and we're just really pleased to have you on Keep It Fictional. So to all of our listeners out there, whether they're sensible, straightforward collectors or psychopaths, we welcome and are happy with all of you. So happy reading, everyone, and have a lovely day. Bye-bye.